I said this for years, and then we made friends with a speech and language therapist, and people were always like, "You don't really have a lisp, do you?" And I mentioned this, like, I got a lisp, and she was like, "Yep, you do, and this is what you do." Like, and she was like, "You're an adult now. You could maybe solve it, but it would be so much hard work, and it's probably not worthwhile." But it is. Most people don't notice it, but I do have, a bit of a. So rolling my R's is a.
Can I just say, like being in a relationship with a speech and language therapist, those guys know so much. Like they know so much. Like the stuff that they know, she tells me. Like like you were saying, like the reason for like what's happening, and they have all the like, obviously all of the terminology for it, but her like knowledge of anatomy as well is insane. And I think like just to say, people get all like, oh, doctors, aren't they wonderful and everything? There's a lot of like clinicians in other fields who know so much and do so much, and they never get the recognition.
This is just people with theology degrees being like, do you know someone went to university and like learned something practical? They learned something like applicable to life at university. What is the life? Hello and welcome to Bread and Rosaries, the UK-based leftist Christian podcast that believes there are simply too many Pokemon nowadays. I'm Ben Molyneux-Headington, and I'm joined by the Magikarp of the podcast, Adam. How you doing, Adam?
Sorry, Magikarp? Dude, like, if I'm anything, I'm a Snorlax. Do you know what I mean?
Do you know what? I thought Snorlax, and I thought, no, that's too obvious and too, like, go a bit different, like...
Yeah, to be fair, you're probably a Snorlax as well. So
I do like to sleep.
The thing is, like, maybe I'm not a Snorlax because sorry. I was going
to introduce our guest.
Pokemon now. Yeah.
Antonia's just sat there like, I'm just going to listen to two idiots about Pokemon for a bit.
Why are we talking about Pokemon?
Because I had to think of an intro. That was basically it. We are joined today by Dr. Antonia Rumpf. Is that right?
Antonio, did you just say?
I think I said Antonia, but I was concentrating on trying to pronounce the surname correctly after we talked about it just before we recorded. Antonia, you are the Equality Officer for the Protestant Church in Bremen, Germany. And the most important question, what Pokemon are you?
The honest and sadly a little bit embarrassing answer is I don't really know, because I was never cool enough to play with Pokemon.
No.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry.
So do you know what? I when I was writing this, I thought, I wonder actually, like, how big a thing Pokemon was in Germany, or like or we'd be like, what is a Pokemon?
I feel like Pokemon's pretty big everywhere, though.
Well, that's what I assumed, but I don't want to,
They
cultural
were
sensitivity.
They were a big thing in Germany. I just lived under a rock. The only ones I know are Pikachu and Lamanda.
So you're a Diglett, is that?
Oh,
maybe.
This is all maybe Pokemon gear.
Feel free to just like make assumptions about what Pokemon I would be, and I'll look them up later and see if I feel represented. Yeah.
I did almost say what's the most German Pokemon, but I think we should like step away from that. Like
Mr. Mime, it's Mr. Mime, it's Mr.
Mime. Okay, sure. Antonia, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a theologian by what I've studied. I focused mostly on practical theology and did my dissertation, like my PhD dissertation in that. I did an interview study on contemporary fasting, which is done like for religious reasons or by people who identify as Christians. However, that is now a little while ago that I handed in. It's been a couple of years, and for the last 3 years or so, I've been working as the Equality Officer in the Church of Bremen, and that is one of the very small regional churches that we have in Germany. It's like structurally roughly equivalent to what would be a diocese in the Church of England. And my tasks there are promoting gender equality, gender justice, and also justice and equal opportunities for people of all sexual orientations. And I try to do that with an intersectional perspective as much as possible. Yeah.
And I don't know if we're allowed to share this, but we're very lucky to have Antonia on the podcast at this time to help us sort of talk about this topic. Because, by the way, Antonia and I have known each other for like some years now.
Yeah,
and like I invited you on the podcast the other day, and what was it you just dropped in the chat?
I'm getting married in 2 days.
Oh,
we're very lucky.
Congratulations.
Oh,
Are you not
you.
more stressed about the things you need to do?
No, I'm more stressed about the election results than about the upcoming wedding, to be honest.
Oh, that was so professional. You don't talk about it. Let's just talk about the topic of today. Like that's
in a way, you could even say they are somewhat related, or at least one topic that has been very prominent in the campaigning for the elections in Germany is also a topic that has, shall I say, informed my partners and my choice to get married, and that is immigration.
Oh, okay.
Maybe we'll get to that later. Yeah. Spoilers alert. Yeah.
That's really that was great. Not only did you steer us to the main topic, you then put in a little teaser to make sure people kept listening. Would you like to
get a move on, guys?
Yeah. Would you like to permanently take over from us?
No, I've just tried to prepare a little bit. It's the first time I'm ever on a podcast, so obviously I thought about it before.
It's all downhill from here. No. You have peaked.
Yeah. And I will say that if I'm honest with you, preparing for it is a little bit of off the vibe. That's kind of not quite that's not what we're going for here, preparation. But I'm
sorry, immediately did it incorrectly.
So as you've hinted at, our main topic today is talk a little bit about the recent German elections, but more kind of generally German politics and how the German church kind of relates to that, is involved in that. But first, we start, as always, with what else is on my mind, Grapes.
What else is on my mind, Grapes?
Adam, I think you have something on your mind, Grapes, that I'm genuinely fascinated to hear more about.
Yeah, I have a confession to make, guys. So I have recently been banned from another building.
How many have you been banned from now? What's the number?
I think we're only on 2, as far as I know. So
what was the first?
The first one was the Scottish Parliament.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
I am now banned from the branch of B&M.
Okay, as a non-Brit, I have to ask what that is. I'm sorry.
B&M's it's like a sort of general, a large general shop. They sell some foodie stuff, some cleaning stuff, animal feed. They're not a supermarket as such, but yeah.
It's also it's a weird place. In terms of they sell some brand name stuff.
You should never go there.
Well, you're not allowed anymore. But there is you can buy brand name stuff, both in terms of the food and drink, but also the appliances and electronics and toys. But there was also a bunch of own brand stuff.
Yeah, that's true.
And and that
really
for crazy cheap.
Actually, so
yeah. I will not lie to you. I own several small kitchen appliances from B&M Home Bargains. So I would not want to be banned. It would ruin when I next need some sort of sandwich toaster or something. That would be my port of call.
Yeah, a sensible port of call. Let's be honest. I am now slightly biased, so I am kind of trying to discourage people from going there. I am going to go back if I need to, by the way. We'll see what happens, but yeah. Okay, so basically what happened is not that interesting how it happened. It's just a bit weird and petty in my opinion. So I went in there, I went into Aldi first, and I went into B&M, and I'm crouching down, selecting some biscuits because that's how I lead my life. And basically, it was because my partner was coming to stay, and she really loves the McVitie's Gold biscuits, a limited edition.
Great choice.
They're good. Other biscuits are available. And so,
if McVitie's would like to sponsor us, we are open to selling out. We wouldn't sell out any of that money, but biscuits, we're open to it.
So they have a deal on where it's like 69p a packet, or like 2 for $1.20 or something, which is like, if you know how much those biscuits are elsewhere, is insane. Like, that's a really good price. So I went in to get some for my partner because she loves them. And I'm crouching down because they're on the bottom shelf. And I hear a voice like vaguely behind me. And I stand up and I turn around. And it's a woman she's wearing an outdoor coat, but I do notice that she does seem to be wearing underneath that coat a B&M like t-shirt. So presumably she's staff. And I just make out, "Can you remove your helmet, please?" Now, my motorcycle helmet is one of those like system helmets where you flip up the whole of the front, so you can see the whole of my face. Right, it's not a problem. But she's seen me from behind. And I think what's happened is she's seen me from behind. And then she said, "Can you remove your helmet?" I've turned around. I've said, "Sorry, I didn't catch that. Can you remove your helmet, please?" She's doubled down, right? And I'm like, "But like, why?" And she's like, "Well, for the CCTV cameras." And I'm like, "Well, you can see my face." Like the whole of the front thing is up. Come in here.
This is so vintage Adam in that
I know.
You are technically you're correct. No one is disagreeing with you that it's silly, but only you would like not just be like, "Oh yeah, sure, fine, I'll take my helmet off." Like...
Yeah, but do you know how much of a pain? No, it's not true. It's not true. Speak to any other motorcyclist. Do you know how much of a pain in the arse it is to have to take your helmet off? Like,
all the cocaine packets spell out, like it's a real...
Yeah, exactly. Oh, come on, man! Like if I've got cocaine, I've already snorted it. Come on, let's be serious.
Adam has repeatedly threatened to do a whole episode on like how motorcycle culture is actually left wing. If you look at it, like
intriguing.
Yes, you have threatened in the past.
I look forward to that episode.
To be fair, some of it is, that's for sure. But anyway, so she asked me to remove my helmet again. I'm like, "But you can see my face." And then, right, she changes her story. She's like, "Yeah, but some people wearing helmets might get violent and headbutt staff with their helmet." And I'm like, "What?" Okay, first of all, that's not what you just said. And second of all, do you honestly think that you're going to prevent that happening by going up to people wearing a helmet and asking them to remove it? Do you think those people are going to go, "Oh, well, now I'm not going to headbutt you in my helmet"? Like, that you're going to make it more likely. It's insane. So, anyway.
Did you try and explain this to her? Because that might have come across as threatening.
Okay, look. I'm not saying that everyone who works in B&M is slow. I'm just saying...
this is going to a bad place, Adam.
I'm just saying that this person was, okay? Because normally I go in B&M and I go in there in my motorbike helmet, same way, like every time. And I get my stuff and I go to the till, I pay, I leave, right? And there's someone at the till who I often will speak to, seems really nice. We have a quick chat and then I go. I went there and she was serving again today. So like I picked up my biscuits. I ignored the commands of this jumped up little Hitler, and I carried on to the till.
Adam.
Okay.
I wish the little Hitlers we had in Germany currently were only talking about motorcycle helmets and taking them off. Like,
sure, but I guarantee you, right, and I don't know this for a fact, but it is a fact, right? I guarantee you that this woman would vote for the AfD. She totally would. She totally would. Anyway.
I don't even know what to say to any of this.
So I ignored her and I just walked to the till because I got my biscuits. I'm going to pay anyway. Clearly, I'm so obviously just walking to the till to pay for my biscuits.
So this woman asked you to do something, you just walked away from her.
Yeah, and then I think I heard a vague voice from like the other side of the shop saying, "Can you take it off, please?" And but I didn't hear that, so I carried on.
People shout at you in the street all the time. To be fair,
yeah, totally.
You're a sex symbol locally. Everyone's like, "Take it off."
Exactly. Look, you can't have tits like this and people not want to see them. That's all I'm going to say.
Oh my! I'm going to have to cut this entire segment, Adam. This is some of the worst stuff you've ever done.
Maybe I'll cut that bit.
I just have a vision of like the notice board in the B&M staff room of like pictures of people who are banned, and it's all like teenagers in hoodies that they refuse to like take the hoodie, like drop the hoodie, and then like
just an annoying 36-year-old pedant. Yeah. So anyway, I went. I paid for my biscuits. Had the little chat that I always have with the person at the tills, who's really nice. And then just as I finished paying, this other woman comes up to me, younger woman, and the person who's asked me to remove my helmet is behind her. And this younger woman says, "Can you make sure you don't come in again, please?" And I'm like, "Why?" She goes, "Because a member of staff asked you to do something and you didn't do it."
It's got real school vibes.
I know. Like, and this is the thing that really annoys me. It's just so many people think that it's their job to act like little micro pigs. You know, there's little police officers everywhere, and it really annoys me. And what really annoys me even more about this is this didn't used to be a problem, right? The only reason we've started seeing more and more of this kind of stuff of trying to get people to remove their helmets or whatever, even though you can see their face. There's a clear ramping up of this stuff after 9/11. You know, this is all about a culture of fear and intolerance.
I think you're right.
Is what annoys me about it.
I do think there's also, we know that a lot of the surveillance systems in places like this are as much for keeping an eye on staff as they are on customers. And actually, I know you'll get upset if I seem to take the woman's side too much, but there is every chance that if she had not challenged you about wearing a helmet, she might have felt like she was going to get in trouble because the policy is to challenge you. What I'm saying I'm blaming the management, not the poor working class women here.
I can't see that. You could be right, but I doubt it. Because if that were the case, all the other times I went in, I would have had someone ask me to remove my helmet, or at least a few of them, and I never have, and I go in there a lot, Never been a problem. I think it was just...
You need the kind of social anxiety that I have that makes you want to immediately comply with any instruction from anyone in the vaguest little bit of authority.
Okay. So I do actually have that, right?
You should listen to that. You know the whole CBT thing about pushing through the. But actually, in this case, I'm saying reverse it, lean into the social anxiety more,
I've done that. I've done that for so long, but there's that other part of me that's always been there, which is the hang on a minute, this sounds unjust. Right? And if you know one thing about me, Ben, you know that I'm all about the justice.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm banned from B&M now. Do you know what was awful though? I went home. And then I got home and I realised I didn't have my wallet. And I'm like, what? Oh no, have I dropped it in B&M?
Oh.
So my housemate has driven... we got my bike gear off and she's going out anyway. So my housemate has driven to B&M and we've looked around the car park and she's kindly gone in to ask if a wallet's been found or anything. And I was genuinely thought that I'd left it at the till, but no, I hadn't. Luckily, I had just looked in a pocket not well enough. So, but yeah, that could have been a lot worse than it was.
Yeah. So you told me to not come back, but I kind of have to come back immediately.
Yeah, exactly.
I thought for this was a genius thing where they banned you because they found your wallet, and they were like, we can take it.
I'm not going to lie, there was a part of me that wanted the wallet to be there.
I get that.
I wanted to go through it again wearing my helmet.
And I'm just saying, I'll say again, Adam, just be more anxious. It's going to help.
The anxiety is there. Don't get me wrong. I am anxious in all of these situations, but just it's overridden by a sense of fuck you.
Okay.
You know?
Yeah. I'm going to put overridden by a sense of fuck you on your tombstone. Like,
I'll take it. There are worse epitaphs.
I think that is probably enough chat about places Adam is banned from. Let's not make this a regular segment on the podcast.
Got to go for a holy trinity, haven't I? Like, where's it going to be next?
Shall we instead move on to our main topic, which is hopefully slightly more consequential and and insightful into the world. But there have been some elections in Germany recently. Yes. It was last weekend, wasn't it?
It was last Sunday, yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Which is would be the 23rd.
Yeah.
Of February, because obviously I don't know when this is coming out. So saying last weekend is not helpful for people listening in the future. But yes, and there is a new chancellor.
Not yet, but chancellor to be. The chancellor presumptive, so to speak.
Yeah. Oh, that's a presumptuous chancellor. That's never good.
Also that, yeah.
So, Antonia, I'm going to ask you to give us a little bit of a kind of an overview of what the results were, how things went, what were the big stories.
Yeah, so the result was in some ways to be expected. So the party who gained the biggest share of the vote is the CDU/CSU. That is what is that?
That is Adam trying to be funny.
I was so offended by their mention that I had to click the bleep button.
Adam is obsessed with the fact he has a soundboard on this and loves to make soundboard noises.
I also have control over the mute button, Ben, so watch yourself.
I see. Okay. So, the CDU/CSU gained the biggest share of the votes, and that came in at 22.6%, making them like the main winners of the election. In second place, also sadly to be expected, was the AfD, who I presume the listeners will know are a far-right party in Germany, currently the biggest far-right party in Germany.
It's a great mix, isn't it, Germany and the far-right? Nothing can come wrong of this, I think.
No, absolutely not. It's not something we've dabbled in before or anything like that.
Well,
and
good luck to you guys, really
wrong. Yeah. And then in third place, we have the SPD, the Social Democrats, at 16.4%. Then comes the Green Party, 11.6%, the Left Party with 8.8%, and then the CSU, which actually always works together with the CDU. They're sort of like, it's a very weird situation. The CDU is the Christian Democrats in all of Germany but Bavaria, and the CSU are the Christian Social Party, the Christian Social Union in Bavaria. So for general elections, they just work together. So the CSU came in at 6%. So CDU and CSU together have 28%. Therefore, the biggest share of the votes. Yeah, and those are all the ones who made it into parliament. There are two parties who notably didn't. You have to gain at least 5% of the votes to be represented in parliament, and one of them is the FDP, the Free Democratic Party. They are, to put it very bluntly, neoliberalists. Like, that's their main thing, neoliberalism. And they came in at 4.3%, so they didn't make it. And then there is another party that describes themselves as left conservative, which is currently called Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht, around their main woman, Sarah Wagenknecht, and chairwoman, who came in at 4.97%. So they just didn't make it.
Oh, how sad.
Not very sad to me personally.
No, I'm maybe slightly sarcastic when I said that.
Don't worry, like, I am German, but I did pick up on that part.
This is German with a sense of humour. I'm not sure about that, Antonia. Like, come on.
Is that even allowed? I don't know. Will it be allowed during this next electoral period? Who knows? But yeah. So that was one of the two interesting things. Would the FDP and or the Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht make it into parliament. Turns out neither of them did. And now the big change will be probably in government, like the government that we, well, technically still have, but had leading up to this election was a coalition made up of the Social Democrats, the SPD, together with the Green Party and the FDP. And in Germany, we called it Ampel-Koalition. Ampel means traffic light because it was red, green,
all your
and
coalitions
yellow.
Have such great names as well.
Yeah,
like
this is true. We are creative like that.
Yeah.
And the neoliberals are yellow. That's their party's main color. And that broke apart in November quite spectacularly, which is why we now had elections. And now the new chancellor will, like with 95% probability, be Friedrich Merz, who is the chairman of the Christian Democrats. That's what they call themselves. Yeah.
And obviously, for UK listeners who aren't necessarily aware of German politics as much, the kind of coalition aspect is a fairly, like, it is the norm, right? That is because obviously the coalition government was a big novelty in some ways in the UK, but the way the German kind of electoral politics works is that governance by coalition is the kind of default.
Yes, absolutely. And it leads to interesting combinations as well. Like, it was the first time we had the Ampel coalition ever on a federal level, state level, so to say. And what is the by far most likely constellation now is that the CDU-CSU will go into coalition with the Social Democrats. We call that Große Koalition, like a great coalition, because those two parties used to be the two biggest parties in Germany. But that is like no longer necessarily the case. I do think member-wise, they are still the two biggest parties, if I'm not mistaken. Didn't look that up. Didn't do that much preparation. But they no longer reliably get the two biggest shares of the vote.
And I guess the big story, in some ways, the change of the chancellorship from a slightly more liberal neoliberal to a slightly more conservative neoliberal is possibly less of the story than the rise of the AfD.
Yeah. That was something that I think sadly most people just expected, because they have been going up in the polls just steadily over the last couple of years. There was a little bit of a dip pretty much exactly a year ago, because there was like some journalists had essentially gone into like a semi-secret meeting of high-ranking AfD politicians together with like other people. I think also some people from other parties, like other more right-wing, like center-right to more right-wing parties, and like other people, where they talked a lot about immigration and how to basically prevent it, or only or severely restrict all the types of immigration that they don't want. And also, perhaps even more shockingly to most people, what they call remigration, so like basically remigration, which is just a way of saying deportation that doesn't immediately sound like you're saying deportation to a lot of people.
Yeah. That's an idea that's kind of floated by a few fringe figures in the UK still a little bit, paying people to return to the country of origin, all that sort of thing. But it has never yet, and hopefully it won't, but I wouldn't want to bet on it, but it hasn't yet reached any sort of mainstream kind of political discourse in this country. It's still very much marginal, but that has kind of become an increasingly part of German politics, has it?
Yeah, very much so, because so when this came out, so journalists basically infiltrated that meeting and then leaked information from it to the public. And it was met with a pretty big outcry, and it has sparked, last year in January, it sparked like lots of really, really big protests, like tens of thousands, in some cities even hundreds of thousands, people protesting against it. And what was sort of nice about it was that it wasn't only like far left people protesting it, but it was a lot of people who consider themselves to be like centrists, who also joined these protests. So at that point, it seemed like maybe there was going to be some broader movement against right-wing policies and politics, and maybe the AfD would take a long-term hit from that. But sadly, that has not been the case, because, they have just been going on steadily with it. They have now added remigration, like remigration, just into their normal vocabulary. And politicians from other parties have also started using that word as if it were like just a normal word that is not like deeply ideologically charged. And that I find very worrying. And in general, the thing I have found most worrying about the development here politically is how much we have allowed the AfD to just dictate what we talk about. Yeah. It's like they talk about migration and immigration, and they obviously almost always phrase it as an issue, a problem to be avoided. And the vast majority of other parties just follow suit and try to I think at the beginning, I could somewhat, even though I didn't agree with it, I could somehow understand the idea, right? Like we say something similar, but not as harsh to maybe convince some people that they should still vote for us in this case, for example, being the CDU, the center-right party, just so they don't vote for like the far-right extremists. But we won't actually do something as bad as they would. But it has been shown in so many election results since that this doesn't work. And the only party who profits from that is the AfD. So it is very disappointing to see how this keeps being repeated and how many media as well just like completely jump on board of that train and talk about migration as if we had no other issues, and even as if migration were always an issue. So yeah,
it's a very, very familiar story, isn't it?
Like, I was going to say I can't relate to this at all. Like supposedly more central parties allowing the far right to dictate narratives of migration. It seems completely alien to me as a British person.
I mean, it's been really incredible recently to see the amount of advertising that Labour is doing on their anti-immigrant kind of policy.
Yeah.
Just everywhere you look, anywhere on social media, you're just bombarded with Labour are getting rid of all of these immigrants and more immigrants than this party got rid of. And it's just gross. And you're right, it doesn't work. You know, why are people going to vote? People who are attracted to sort of, you know, far right talking points, why are they going to vote for, you know, fascism light when they can get full fat fascism, you know?
Yeah. And I think one like nice thing about this election, or like something that sparked hope in me that relates to this, is that I think the party that really didn't go along with that and didn't also make migration the main topic of their campaign was Die Linke, the left party, who have instead decided to focus a lot on social justice. Like they went around during their campaigns talking to people, like just like, you know, canvassing at flats and everything and being like, what are the main issues for you? Can you pay your rent? Obviously, lots of people said, no, I can't, because that's a huge issue currently.
But that's like migrants' faults, right? Like that's to do with migrants. My understanding is that it's
obviously
most landlords are immigrants, is my understanding of the
yeah. Yeah, you know, like, and energy prices and stuff like that. So like they did also a lot of like very concrete help. Like they helped people apply for like welfare systems and stuff like that. Like they actually concretely help people out, and this is hugely paid off because the left party, it seemed for the longest time of the campaign that they would maybe only scrape by or only just get into parliament. Like actually last general elections, that is what happened. Last general elections, they only gained 4.9% of the votes. So theoretically, they wouldn't have been in parliament. The only reason they still did is because in Germany, we have 2 votes. One goes to a party. That is the one that does just like proportional representation. But our other vote goes to a direct candidate in each constituency, kind of like the system that you have in the UK, where you have constituencies and in each one an MP is directly elected. And because the left party managed to win 3 constituencies, they were then allowed to be in parliament. That's right. Like the rule. Even if you get less than 5%, generally, if you manage to win 3 constituencies, you're still in. So that's the only reason they got in 2021. And it looked for the vast majority of the campaigning like it was probably going to go the same way. But now the fact that they ended up at like 8.8% is very cool, I think. Like, that did take me by a positive surprise. And it's nice to see that it very much paid off for them to not also jump on the migration is bad bandwagon, but actually talk about other things that are hugely important to people. Like, how can I afford my rent? How can I afford food? Why do I work 50 hours a week and still don't have enough money to live off? Right. Yeah.
I think it's probably worth mentioning as well that the Green Party are not especially left-wing in Germany.
Not anymore.
We might be, a UK audience might be tempted to kind of see a Green Party as fairly left-wing in sort of electoral terms, at least, because, as liberal as they have been recently, the Green Party of England and Wales, whilst it has become a little bit more left-wing again, has still been, quite liberal of late, but it's more left-wing than any other party, I think, probably in Parliament, with any seats in Parliament at the moment, as far as I can remember. And in some respects, I would say that Die Linke are probably closest to the British Green Party.
Yeah, that is also my impression.
The two Green parties would be. But one thing I will say, and we will talk about it a little bit later, it's encouraging to see Die Linke kind of doing a bit better and focusing on those kinds of issues as well, and not on the immigration stuff. But it's been a bit of a mixed bag on Palestine with Die Linke as well. So, yeah, we'll get to that though.
I think it's been a mixed bag on Palestine with all parties that are in Parliament.
Well, I was going to say it's been a bag of utter shit from most parties, whereas Die Linke, it's been a bit more mixed. But
and I think actually it's worth mentioning, because that's arguably the case in the UK as well. But there is, to my understanding, and Antonia, you will be far better informed on this than me, there is a particular kind of special relationship with Israel that Germany has in its kind of political.
Don't you love that phrase, special relationship in a political context?
Yes, and I enjoy it as much as I enjoy relationships. I don't know which is worse, ours with US, but special relationships generally not great.
Yeah, I think that in Germany, or not I think, but it is just a fact that the leading politicians in Germany have, for the last decades, described solidarity with Israel as a state as something that must be a governing principle for any German government. It's part of what we call Staatsräson. So basically it has to be something that leads any government. And I think that this comes to an extent from a sense of, at first, guilt, then these days probably more so a feeling of responsibility because of the Shoah and the Holocaust, and wanting to make a very strong commitment to never let anything like that happen again, which in itself I think is not a wrong sentiment, right? I don't ever want anything like that to happen again, right? I think that is something that most people would probably agree on, right? We don't want another Holocaust. It has led to some politicians basically saying that they want to back Israeli policies and Israeli governments pretty much no matter what.
Yeah.
This is something that Friedrich Merz, for example, our most likely next chancellor, has also explicitly stated. And in light of current events in Palestine, Israel, that is obviously something that is also starting to be criticized by some people, because what Israel is doing there is obviously described in various different ways, and it's currently reviewed by the ICC, not the ICC, the other one, which is the
ICJ.
The ICJ, yeah, thank you. I always mix up all the abbreviations and stuff. And in that kind of situation, it is obviously the specific commitment to say we stand with an Israeli government rather than saying we stand with Jewish people and we want to protect Jewish people. Instead saying we stand with this government no matter what, carries a flavor that obviously sits at odds with what a lot of people think would be appropriate here.
I've been disgusted by how our parties and our politicians and our media class, particularly sort of legacy media, have dealt with this whole issue. But when I've looked at what's going on in Germany and how, like, I'm not scared to say the things that I say. I'm passionately standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people. And I'm not scared to say that. But a lot of people in Germany, I think, are. And it seems to be with good reason.
I'm interested to hear a little bit more about, you kind of talked about the kind of sense of guilt that has morphed into responsibility. I find that really fascinating in comparison, and I don't want to draw any direct comparisons here between the British Empire and the Holocaust, but recognising that the British Empire, was on some level a historical subjugation of people, and the push in this country has been very much either, it was a long time ago, to forget about it, that's the liberal approach, or the conservative approach, which was don't talk it down, it was actually great. So I'm interested to hear a little bit more about how that sense of kind of guilt or responsibility functions in that kind of political arena, I guess.
Yeah, how often do people talk about how wonderful the railways are? That's
yeah. Because we built a bunch of those in India, and that really forgives pretty much anything else we did. So
there is a German-Jewish writer I really like, Max Czolek. He has written a book, like he's written several books, but one is called Versöhnungstheater, which translates to like theater of reconciliation, but could also be translated as theatrics of reconciliation. And in that he sort of says that a lot of times when non-Jewish white Germans talk about the Holocaust and, being proud about our Erinnerungskultur, our culture of commemoration, and how well we've dealt with it now, allegedly, what they really talk about is themselves. And what it is really about is they want to come across in front of others and also probably in front of themselves as good people who stand on the right side of history, because we have learned from our horrific past and we are not going to allow anything like that to happen again, ever, because we are now good people. Like, this is when I read it, I found it really helpful to just like critically reflect upon myself as well, because obviously I also want to be a good person, right?
Yeah.
And obviously I want to be an ally against anti-Semitism, and it is important to note that anti-Semitism in Germany is a real issue, right? Like, a lot of Jewish people here do not feel safe. Synagogues have been attacked. People get spat on the streets or threatened and stuff because they're Jewish or being perceived as Jewish. That obviously is a real issue. And obviously I want to do something against it. And I do think it's good when politicians also want to do something against it.
Yeah.
I think an issue that I've seen is that especially conservative politicians focus a lot on anti-Semitism that they say comes from Muslim people. Usually it's also Muslim immigrants that they talk about here, and they call it imported anti-Semitism.
That is,
it's awful.
That jars, doesn't it?
Yeah,
that phrase.
It does. Although I think that phrase jars. What you're describing is not at all alien to this country, and is I think increasingly, using anti-Semitism as a way to be Islamophobic is an increasing thing.
And the real issue is that in doing so, like, they are overlooking how much anti-Semitism we have in Germany that is coming from far-right white German, usually men, but obviously like it's men who carry out the attacks. Obviously there's anti-Semitic women though as well. And I think that is a real problem and also a real danger, because a lot of educational programs and like youth programs are getting their funding cut by more conservative local governments. And I find it a bit odd that some politicians talk very, very staunchly and like very passionately about how they are so against anti-Semitism, but they sort of get a bit more quiet when that's regarding anti-Semitism that is coming from white German citizens. And I do think there's a bit of a double standard going on there.
Whilst a fragile ceasefire seems to be holding in Gaza, the struggle for a free Palestine is far from over. Violence in the West Bank, Israeli bans on aid agencies, and American imperialism are just a few of the threats to the safety and flourishing of Palestinian communities. We are daily inspired by the determination, steadfastness, and persistence of Palestinians. Christians for Palestine continues to organise a Christian presence at the national marches for Palestine, as well as working locally in grassroots movements for change. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram, or email christiansforpalestineuk@gmail.com to get involved.
I wanted to ask about the sort of socioeconomic kind of situation, because obviously it's the same old story, right? The far right is generally driven by those with a little bit more money, a little bit more power, but then starts to grow and get bigger when there is an economic downturn, right? And that's partly what we've seen happening in Germany recently. But I think there's also elements around regions as well. So obviously East Germany, we know, still has a lot more poverty, kind of less development than West Germany does generally. And obviously Bavaria is a bit of a special case as well. And I wanted to ask about the role of poverty in the rise of the far right, and B, how that looks sort of regionally, whether you can speak into that at all. But also just how people are talking. Like, have you had conversations with, normies about politics at all? Have you heard anyone talking and what are they saying that they're voting for or that their issues are?
So with regards to poverty, the AfD are definitely pandering to poor people. They do want their votes, and they claim that they will make the situation better by, deporting immigrants usually. And also another thing that they are really hating on the AfD is anything regarding climate protection and climate measures. They claim also that that has cost the state way too much money that should have been going elsewhere.
Got to worship Lord Mammon, haven't you?
Yeah. I mean, at least if the planet burns, the Nazis will be gone as well, I hope. But at what cost, right? At what cost?
We've made a hell of a lot of money for the shareholders as well. So that's the real moral win in this.
But yeah, what is probably important to stress is that the proposed financial plans that the AfD have, regarding taxes and stuff, won't actually benefit poor people.
Shocking.
Yeah, right. Who would have thought? But actually, the people who would profit most from the financial and economic plans of the AfD are people who are middle or upper middle class, and especially millionaires. So the average working class person would not actually profit if the AfD were in power and could just put their plans into practice. Regarding the East, yeah, it is true that the AfD has had a lot more early success, especially in the eastern federal states of Germany. However, this has really starting to even out because East Germany or the eastern federal states, they have far less people in them, essentially. So if there weren't also a lot of West German people who voted for the AfD, they would have not gotten that kind of a strong result nationwide. And I think this is a difficult situation. And for disclosure, I am West German myself. I mean, I was born after the reunification, but I grew up in various cities that were all in former West Germany. And I know that quite a few people who grew up in the former GDR are now in the Eastern federal states. They are getting really quite hurt and also annoyed by the fact that everybody always blames the East. And I remember 10 years ago when there were the first federal states in the East where the AfD had huge regional and local successes. People in the West were joking oh, can't they make them go away again? Can't they be their own state again? So they're gone from us. And that is obviously something that doesn't work. And I think that kind of sometimes really arrogance from like Western Germans has also sometimes maybe played a part in East Germans being even more frustrated. And in the beginning, a lot of people voted for the AfD, I think, out of frustration. But I think those days are also now long past. Like they've been doing openly right-wing and partly fascist policies for years now. I don't think there's any kind of excuse now. Like if you vote for them, you vote for a fascist party, and that's that, right?
I feel like it's a very kind of liberal, like short-sighted liberal joke to make, to say, oh, can't we, get rid of them? Can't they be a different state again? Because it completely ignores the underlying, the root causes of all these things, and imagines that you and yours could never possibly do the same. But actually, as you say, it's evening out. So clearly that's not true.
Also just shows a complete disregard for all the people who are already really suffering in Eastern federal states, where like the AfD have had a lot more power for a longer time, to just say like, oh, well, let's close them off again. I mean, like instead of thinking like, oh, what could we maybe do to help? Because obviously this has like huge negative impacts. Like there have been several like pride marches, for example, up until now only in East Germany, but I do very much assume that this will spread out as well and also occur in Western Germany. Basically, like on the Pride Day, there were also huge Nazi parades. Jesus. And they basically tried to like scare gay people and their allies pretty much back into the closet, which is incredibly worrying to see. And yeah.
And it's worth saying as well, because I know some people who, well, I know one guy in particular, but I know some people who are right-wing, basically far right, maybe not the furthest right, but pretty much there, who are also gay and all for gay rights and everything. And it's that same
the old
thing of like
Milo Yiannopoulos.
And it's that classic thing of like, who do you think they're going to come for next, mate? Like, they're not on your side. They're not on any of our sides.
I mean, on this note, it's notable to point out that Alice Weidel, who was the first and foremost candidate of the AfD and as chairwoman, like she lives in a relationship with a woman. She's married to a
Greek
woman.
A Greek woman. Yeah. It's always different rules for them, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
And I do sometimes wonder what it's like in her head. Like, does she think that after she's like gotten so many successes for the party, does she think she'll be safe? Does she genuinely think that? Or does she think that maybe eventually the party will change their stance? That like, I have genuinely no idea. It seems, or is she just thinking, oh, well, I'm going to ride the wave of power while I can, and then I'll just use all the huge amount of money that I have and just move somewhere else with my family when it starts to get like dangerous.
Doesn't she live in like Austria or something anyway?
Switzerland, I think.
Switzerland, yeah.
I think. I hope that isn't incorrect, but
no, I think you're right. I think I was just remembering incorrectly.
Yeah.
I had a conversation a few years ago with my next door neighbour. And at the time it was the whichever election it was where Corbyn lost to Johnson.
2019.
19, yeah. And I was having a chat with my next door neighbour, and she couldn't believe, because I was a bit critical of Boris Johnson, and she goes, "Oh, would you rather have Jeremy Corbyn?" And I'm like,
yes.
I would die for him.
I wouldn't go that far, clearly, because Jeremy Corbyn's politics are not my own, but good goddamn, like, yes.
Yeah.
And I just think the media, obviously the thing that we talk about all the time with Jeremy Corbyn and what happened to him, but the media has poisoned people's minds so much that they ended up voting for someone like Boris Johnson. And I wonder, like, have you seen that kind of thinking as well? Like the media kind of getting behind the AfD, or even just kind of the CDU and all of these kinds of talking points that are kind of nasty.
Or potentially going after Die Linke, which I imagine might also have been the case.
I mean, with Die Linke first, they have always caught a lot of flack from a lot of people because... I don't want to go in like too much detail, and also like I'm not an expert on that party's history, but like basically one wing of that party, or not even a wing, but like some people in that party were already members of the SED, the Socialist Unity Party, which was the one party in the GDR. And after the GDR ended and Germany was reunified, some remnant members of the SED founded a party of democratic socialism, which in Eastern federal states had quite a bit of success after reunification of Germany. And then in the Western federal states, there were like other various small parties or just like movements that were also like basically in line of democratic socialism. And after lots and lots of trials and tribulations, there was quite a big group of people who split from the Social Democrats at some point, and that eventually formed the party that is now today, Die Linke. And because there are some people who have already been SED members in the GDR, that is one reason why some people from the center and further right have always like denounced Die Linke as like, you know, a totalitarian party, people who want to bring the GDR back, people who are Stalinists. And so in a way, they've always been criticized by a lot of like more conservative media. So I don't think there's anything necessarily new here. And also with the party currently being much younger than it ever was, like they have had a lot of new members in recent weeks, I think that criticism is becoming harder and harder to make just because the party has changed quite a bit. And also Sarah Wagenknecht, who now broke off with her Bündnis Sarah Wagenknecht from Die Linke, was also one of the people still already coming from the GDR. So, yeah.
She is someone I would really like to give a poke in the eye.
She's someone I would so love to have an in-depth talk with. Like when I was 14
You're a nicer
15,
person than Adam.
Like when I was 14 or 15, Sarah Wagenknecht was one of my idols. Like I looked up to her so much because that's when she was like still a proper leftist, right? Yeah. And she's incredibly intelligent. I think she's very, very well educated. She's extremely well spoken and eloquent. Like I remember being a teenager, seeing her in talk shows and just being like, oh man, I wish I could talk like that. That is so cool. And now seeing like the weird 180 turn that she seems to have been doing, but obviously now it begs.
Do you think she believes it though?
Or
do you think it's just like a strategy thing?
I genuinely do not know. And like, this is exactly why I would love to talk to her. Like, it's been horrible to see. Like, it's been one of the things that were really, really frustrating for me in recent years, to see somebody that I thought was like, you know, somebody who would stand with people who are oppressed, really not do that, but like turn at the first opportunity against trans people, for example, against even queer people in general, against climate justice, which obviously also affects a lot of marginalized people on a global scale. It was just extremely, extremely grotesque to see.
Did she like get kicked in the head by a horse or something? Like, has something happened to her that's just...
In this country, we call this doing Ken Livingstone.
Yeah.
I really don't know.
Could be worse. Could be George Galloway.
I think the difference is that Galloway was never that like impressive.
No, he's always been a
Whereas Livingstone, and this is like, I was shocked to discover this because I've always known Livingstone as like a figure of like, you know, ridicule or whatever. But like, you go back in Livingstone's history,
he was like really, certainly in Labour terms, he was pretty, really quite radical.
Yeah, and I mean, to address the other part of your question, have media taken like a stance for the AfD, or have they endorsed similar positions? I personally don't think that any mainstream media so far have like openly endorsed the AfD, because I think that would still be taboo in mainstream media. Obviously, there are like right-wing publications that do. But there are quite a few, especially from like what we call Springerpresse, like Axel Springer being one really, really huge media publishing house. They come out with Germany's most sold, well, they call themselves a newspaper. I would say they're more like a tabloid, which is called Bild, the Bild Zeitung, which is just like, I would call it a very right-wing publication.
Like the Scum, but in German.
Sort of, yeah. And then they have a slightly more serious, slightly more respectable outlet called Die Welt, but it's, I would say, just as
uses bigger words, but...
Yeah, exactly. It uses bigger words, but it's kind of very similar from an ideological standpoint and content-wise as well. And those have endorsed very conservative talking points. They have also definitely built up the whole, like, you know, they do very, very dramatic reportings and like also like scandalizing stuff on migration. And obviously there have been some terrorist attacks in Germany in the last few years that were factually carried out by people who actually were immigrants. Some of them didn't have any kind of visa status. Some of them maybe even were illegal. And obviously it's always horrible when something like that happens. And it's also horrible, I think, when then media use that to turn people against immigrants in general, instead of like asking, why is it possible? Like, why do we have a system that forces immigrants to live in such horrible conditions where they don't get access to mental health resources? Because a lot of times they had mental health issues and just couldn't get help for that, right? And I think that's a huge failing here. And instead of just talking about, oh, we need to close our borders, we should actually talk about how can we have a migration system that actually works, you know, where people can come into the country and can be treated with dignity and with respect. And a lot of media have like not gone that route, but just instead kind of used various events to sort of like fire up prejudice.
I suppose you see a lot of that on social media as well, like just fanning the flames constantly.
Exactly.
And there's a similar thing over here, isn't there, where media organisations don't have to come out and bat for far-right parties or even policies, but, you know, even supposedly kind of impartial or centrist or liberal or whatever, things like the BBC will talk about small boats and migration and all that sort of thing in a way that
more
legitimizes the topics, isn't it? If you officially oppose someone like the AfD, but you allow their talking points to dictate the news cycle, you are legitimizing them, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. And that is definitely something that has been happening here. And I mean, like, just for comparison, because yes, there have been horrible attacks, but for example, something that has been happening far more often in Germany last year were femicides, which is, you know, when women are killed by their partner or ex-partner. And in Germany, that has happened about every other day last year. And that is not something that has led to any kind of nationwide media-fueled outcry. And I would really love to see, you know, parties that conservative parties sometimes even say, oh, we need to reduce immigration because those migrants endanger our women, right? They use that and present themselves as like saviors of women's rights and like saviors of women. But somehow they are extremely quiet when women are getting murdered by their partners or ex-partners. And I would really love to see all parties bend backwards over themselves in the same way they do regarding regulating migration when it comes to other topics like, for example, femicides and violence against women, which is just very overlooked on a nationwide political scale, which I think just tells you a lot.
You heard it here first. Antonia's policy platform is to deport all men. Let's take a break from it might work. Let's not knock until we try it. Let's take a break from this. We'll come back in a minute and talk a little bit more about churches and Christians' role in this. But before that, I have a Saint of the Week for you.
Saint of the Week.
Have either of you heard of Father Des Wilson?
I have not, no.
Don't think so.
All right, that's good. So, Father Des Wilson was a Catholic priest who spent most of his life and career in Belfast, in Ireland. He was ordained in 1949, and he's kind of known for developing his own kind of form of liberation theology. Kind of drew from that Latin American liberation theology, but kind of focusing in, as liberation theology always does, on the issues within his community. He identified himself as a pacifist, but he refused to condemn kind of nationalist paramilitary groups. He justified this by saying the primary role of a pacifist is to prevent like violence and war, and that condemning these groups didn't actually lead towards like reducing violence and war. And there's a quote where he says that, you know, if Catholics in Ireland had committed to total pacifism. Quote, there would not have been a Catholic home still standing in Belfast by the end of 1969. And so it's quite interesting for someone to be a self-identified declared pacifist, but have a very nuanced take on kind of paramilitary organisation and a very nuanced take on violence. He recognised that some of the paramilitaries were infiltrated by the British state and spies, so he wasn't completely convinced by all of them, but he was genuinely sympathetic for the Irish people who joined these groups and took up arms within that struggle. There's a quote of his: if you get close enough to these men, you discover they are the type who wouldn't have taken up arms unless they were driven to it, unlike the soldiers taking up arms as professions or politicians who use violence to further their own political ends.
That's really powerful.
Yeah, I think it's such a powerful way of seeing it,
especially
isn't it?
With relation to Palestine at the moment.
Yeah. And that is, definitely one of the reasons he jumped out at me as someone to talk about a little bit, is someone who really carefully navigated that line about talking about violence, whilst being someone who was clearly a man of peace, clearly wanted peace, and actively worked towards peace, but also recognised, the reality of the situation. And in fact, he was very careful, although he kind of deplored violence, he would never condemn paramilitary groups or paramilitary acts of violence in any of his kind of public speaking or writing, but would always focus very explicitly on the British state and the security services and the way that those things had created the circumstances in which violence would inevitably emerge. So very careful to kind of say the cause of all this is the colonialist oppression, and not looking to condemn the kind of paramilitary groups within that, to the extent where actually voting for Sinn Féin was kind of forbidden by the Catholic Church, technically, and he publicly defended people not only voting Sinn Féin, but actually publicly defended Catholics' right to take up arms if it was the right thing to do in that situation. From the 70s onwards, really, he was actually quite heavily involved in mediating between loyalists and unionists. No, those are the same thing, aren't they? That wasn't much of a negotiation, although he did. So actually, he was involved in negotiations between nationalist factions as well. So he kind of brokered peace within the nationalist camp, as well as worked between nationalist and unionist kind of groups to do that. He's often credited with being one of the people that was involved in kind of laying the groundwork for the Good Friday Agreement, because he, built up those relationships and enabled people to actually have conversations about the future of Ireland. He was very critical of the Catholic hierarchy. He argued for a significant reduction in the power of the Vatican and papacy. He kind of implied he would like there not to be a pope anymore quite a few times. So a Catholic who did not always toe the line.
To be fair, the Pope was John Paul II, so you can see where he was coming from.
If you're a liberation theologian. But he also felt very strongly that the Catholic Church had failed to support Irish Catholics, and basically said if the Catholic Church had done what it could have done, we would not have seen the same oppression and violence towards Irish Catholics as we saw. Like the Catholic Church as an institution, he felt failed to actually support Irish Catholics. So in 1975, he ends up resigning as a priest, feeling that he can no longer justify his formal role in the church. And his bishop, who had already clashed with him a few times, was so upset with him that the bishop never spoke to him again in any, just refused to ever speak to them. And obviously he's, becoming a priest, he might have resigned his job, but he was a Catholic priest for life. That's the no matter how much trouble he was in, he was still a Catholic priest, but the bishop would not speak to him. So after resigning his paid role there, he did loads of community work, quite a little media work. He found as a priest that doors were open to him that kind of the average Irish Catholic would not get access to the media this kind of way. So he did a lot of that. He kind of did a big push for American firms to kind of take on hiring practices and HR processes that opposed sectarianism and kind of supported Catholics in Ireland. Really interestingly, he also advocated quite strongly against religious education in schools. So he attended a Catholic school and kind of hated it. And he felt that if the church was going to have any involvement in education, it should focus on the kind of lifelong learning needs of students rather than religious education. And I think he partially felt this on like a kind of principle level, that we need to give people what they actually need. But he also said that kind of religious worship was really a matter for adults. And I don't think he meant that in like a no kids in church, but so much as like that if you made it part of schooling, when children became adults, they would then see religious practice as something you left behind in childhood along with the other stuff you did in school, which is quite a radical position to take, particularly in Ireland at this time. Catholic schooling was fairly prevalent. He wanted more democracy in churches. He wanted greater equality between priests and lay people. And he was regularly kind of questioning Catholic social teaching, particularly on divorce. Final fun fact, which I really enjoyed. He was a big fan of Gerry Adams, who was the leader of Sinn Féin and has strongly denied ever being involved in paramilitary groups, which you can take with however big a pinch of salt you'd like.
I mean, I've got time for Gerry Adams in certain ways, but that is quite funny.
Yeah. He needs to do it, right? There's a reason he does it. Yeah. So Wilson worked with Adams quite extensively, and Adams felt that Wilson was vital to the peace process. And Wilson said that Gerry Adams was one of the few people who could have made that peace process happen. But the fun fact is that Des Wilson was the officiant at Gerry Adams' wedding.
Amazing.
And I think that's because Wilson was the parish priest. I think that may even be how they actually met in the first place, because he was still a practicing priest at the point that Adams gets married. So I don't know. I don't think Adams chooses him, but yeah, this guy was Gerry Adams' vicar, or priest, I should say. So there's Wilson for you. Yeah, really interesting guy. Yeah.
Saint of the week.
So you kind of mentioned that the CDU are the kind of Christian party. It's in their name.
Yes.
So what is the kind of, I guess, role of Christianity, public Christianity, within German politics? If you've got a big kind of, is it Christian Democrat Party? Is that the...
Yes, exactly.
So do we read that as being the party of Christians, or is it a slightly more complicated story?
Well, it ain't the party of Jesus, is it? Let's face it.
That's very much not the same thing.
It is a lot more complicated than that, unsurprisingly, I think. While the CDU and in most of Germany it's called CDU, Christian Democratic Union, and then in Bavaria the CSU, Christian Social Union, and sometimes together they are just called the Union, die Union. They do call themselves the Christian Party or a Christian Party. There are a lot of Christians in Germany, like especially in my church, the Protestant Church in Germany, who
Sorry, you could have just stopped there. There are a lot of Christians in Germany, especially in my church. That's good.
I could have stopped there, but
that's what I thought you were going to do.
But that would have been incredibly incorrect, because we've been losing members left, right, and centre.
And anyone coming in is an atheist.
That would have been misinformation, I think, and I'm not about that, trying to not spread misinformation. But so there are a lot of Christians who do not feel represented by the political values and by the policies of the CDU, CSU. And it has actually been an ongoing debate in German media and society over the last couple of years of whether the church, that being the Protestant Church in Germany, like the big mainline Protestant Church, is too left green, basically. Like a lot of more conservative and like center media outlets and also people perceive the Protestant Church, especially like the chairperson of the Council of the Protestant Church, which is like the main representative who doesn't hold any actual power, but obviously whose voice still holds quite a bit of weight, as usually coming from a fairly like anything from Social Democrat or Green affiliated. I don't know if that's actually always strictly true. But if you look at a lot of stances that the Protestant Church has been taking over the last couple of years, it is not incorrect to say that a lot of them probably align more with social democratic and or green talking points than conservative talking points. They have been very vocal on climate change. They have been very critical, especially in this last round of campaigns for the election, very critical against like the whole anti-immigration talking points. They have sort of stressed that that's becoming increasingly inhumane in tone and in content.
Commies to me.
That is what a lot of people say. Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
No, that's exactly the same over here.
Yeah.
Whenever any church person talks about immigration and says maybe we shouldn't just like shoot people in the sea, people lose their shit.
Yeah, wild stance to take, isn't it? Right?
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, and like especially regarding these elections, I don't know how much of that has really made it across the channel into like the UK and also other countries. But like briefly before the general elections, there were some notable events in the German parliament, the Bundestag, where Friedrich Merz, our chancellor-to-be, basically his party issued a motion in favor of like restricting migration even further. And 2 days later also proposed a law to a very similar effect. And due to obviously the talks that happen in a parliament before an issue, like a motion is issued, it was already clear that the Social Democrats and the Greens and the lefts wouldn't have done it ever, but like the Social Democrats and the Greens weren't going to vote with it. They were not going to vote in favor of it. So Merz knew in advance that the only people backing the motion would be the FDP, the neoliberals, and the AfD, who very openly and vocally said, oh yeah, we're absolutely going to support that because that is exactly what we want. Actually, you, Friedrich Merz, are stealing all of our policies. That is a point that Alice Weidel has made repeatedly throughout the campaign. Sadly, it has to be said, not entirely incorrectly. Like there are obviously there are still marginal differences between CDU and AfD, like party programs. I'm not going to deny that. Like they're not just like outright the same, but the similarities also cannot be overlooked. The rhetoric is obviously horrible to like state it like that. She's not entirely incorrect in saying that, much as I loathe saying that Alice Weidel is not entirely incorrect in saying something.
Well, stopped clock and all that. I mean, and it's a thing that we hear a lot, like no matter where you are, there's always politicians saying, well, they're stealing all our policies now to make them so. Like, it happens all the time. So it's not surprising.
So like Friedrich Merz had previously, like after our former government had broken down, Friedrich Merz had been all like, oh yeah, we'll make sure that in this like intermission period, only things pass the Bundestag with like, you know, an agreement between the democratic parties, which means not the AfD in politician speak. And then he very clearly went back on his word there, because despite knowing that the motion would only succeed with the support of the AfD, he put it forward and it passed because CDU, FDP and AfD MPs voted together in favor of that motion. That didn't have any actual concrete effect because it wasn't like a law, but it was obviously of huge symbolic impact.
It's that whole thing again of like scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds.
Basically, yeah. Like in Germany, we would call it Steigbügelhalter. Like that is, I don't know the English word for that, but it is
whatever it means, we'll go with that.
It is the person who holds up like the, you know, when you get on a horse, you put your foot into the little thingy, the stirrup, is it that?
Yeah.
And the person who holds that up so you can get on the horse. In this case, the horse of fascism that has obviously in German history before been conservative parties and centrists.
I feel sorry for horses in this analogy.
Yeah, right. That's some animal cruelty there. And the churches have like very vocally criticized that. And even like the two main representatives, both of the Protestant and the Catholic Church in Germany, like towards the parliament, they sent a letter to all MPs basically saying, we are really concerned about this. Like there had been an agreement by the democratic parties that that this would not happen. Like they wouldn't put forward things that were supported by the AfD and could get a majority with support of the AfD. And it's very concerning that somebody is going back on their word on this. And like we strongly urged you to think about what that would mean. Yeah. They also said, which is also important to note, that like that motion, it is very unclear if that was actually like compatible with EU law and the German constitution. Like it's quite possible. I'm no legal expert, so I can't judge that. But like, I mean, it is quite likely that it was very unconstitutional.
As someone who lives in the UK,
right?
I don't think too many politicians are that concerned about like EU and international law being broken. Let's be honest.
So it's also interesting because the British perspective, rightly or wrongly, is very much the EU law is whatever Germany says EU law is going to be, right? Like that is the like it is very much seen like certainly a big one, or not the biggest by any stretch of imagination, but one of the things driving that kind of anti-EU Leave campaign stuff was that sense that decisions being made, and it is often seen as Germany kind of being the
particularly it has more power than any other country,
particularly under Merkel. I was seen as the thing. I'm interested to know, you kind of mentioned you got the kind of main Protestant and main Catholic Church. Does the CDU have any relationships, formal or informal, with kind of church denominations or even just kind of groups of Christians, or is it much more of a rhetorical, like we are, in this country we get that the phrase is used like Judeo-Christian values and that sort of thing. Like Christianity is much more a rhetorical device. Is that kind of what we're seeing there, or is there a connection to kind of actual Christian groups, movements, people?
I mean, I don't think that in necessarily more or less than with other parties. In the Protestant Church of Germany, which is like what I can speak for with most, like something that comes close to expertise, there are people in prominent positions, like in the Synod, for example, who are members of all different sorts of democratic parties. And that includes, obviously, CDU, CSU people. I could imagine that maybe in Bavaria, there's a specifically strong connection with Catholicism, seeing that is like one of the most strong Catholic regions. But the CDU or CSU, they in general are not like tied to any specific denomination. Typically mainline churches, much less, I think, free churches. But yeah, just to like quickly wrap up that story, like the motion basically passed. That didn't put anything into effect. But like 2 days later, like it led to a huge outcry. It led to another wave of protests with like tens and hundreds of thousands of people protesting. And 2 days later, the CDU then tried to like actually get a law passed with the same kind of majorities. And that failed because too many members of parliament from the CDU and from the FDP actually abstained from voting. So maybe there are a few people who still, have a spine or still thought that was maybe going a little bit too far, which was, small mercies. But at least that law didn't come into effect, which had the absolutely horrible name of Zustrombegrenzungsgesetz, which basically means a law to restrict influx or inflow, which obviously, we're talking about people here, right? But they make it sound like a force of nature or like even a catastrophe of nature, which is just awful and just like racist. It's just horrible to see. Yeah. But it was kind of nice to see that there was clear criticism from the church on that, I think.
Yeah. We hear similar language, I think, over here when they talk about like an invasion or a swarm. It's really sort of incendiary kind of language that they use. I think that the difference is, you could have said literally anything then, and I would have thought, oh, yes, that sounds terrible. Whereas before, when you said, oh, this thing sounds good, I would say, oh, yes, that sounds wonderful.
So I'm interested to know, you kind of mentioned this letter that got into all the MPs and the Protestant and Catholic churches. Is that is there a kind of history of churches kind of taking political stands or having political interventions, or was this a more unusual kind of situation where they felt like it'd gone so far they had to kind of step in?
Interestingly, the people who wrote these letters, I don't think they are people who are generally well known by the public. Like the German public probably knows the chairperson of the Council of the Protestant Church of Germany. She's the highest representative, but I don't think they know the person who's like the spokesperson for the Protestant Church within Parliament. And these are the two people who like sent that letter. I personally don't actually know how often that occurs, if that's like a regular thing for them, or if that was like a oh dear, now we really have to do something moment. It is not uncommon of church officials, like both the chairperson of the Council of the Protestant Church, but also just like the chair people or like the bishops or whatever they are called of the different regional churches to say things on political matters. That is fairly normal here. And obviously there are always people who say like, oh no, the church should never be political. It's only like your private thing. But that is, I think, a minority opinion. Like most people think
and
it's normal.
One.
I would say it's not the soundest of theologies, but yeah. But like, I don't think most people take issue with the church taking political stances. Something that is usually frowned upon here is church people taking stances that are directly like in favor or against a specific party. That is something that most church leaders here have not done, because last time they did it, it was to side with Hitler. And
yeah, it went well, yeah.
It did not go well. I do want to point out that it did absolutely not go well.
Can we just clarify? You are anti-Hitler, right? Like, we should have got this out first.
I know this is a powerfully autistic podcast, but I was joking there. Ben asks if there's like a history of this kind of thing, and I just immediately want to go, yeah, there is, Ben. There is. Have you heard of?
I kind of meant in the kind of more recent history was my... Something I noticed is your job role is that you are an equality officer. And I used my trusty friend Google Translate, so accuracy may not be right, but to kind of have a look at the kind of equality stuff that was talked about on the kind of Dominations website. There's kind of a version of doing equality work, which is still valuable, but is like, we're going to be, nice to queer people, like we're going to remind you gently to use the right pronouns for people, stuff that's important, but it's slightly, it kind of just boils down to being kind. And obviously that's really important.
Liberal identity politics.
Yeah, and actually what I really noticed is that, some of the stuff that is involved in the equality work of this church is specifically like right-wing extremism and anti-feminism stuff.
Yeah.
And it felt like a significantly more political way of seeing equality, which I was, really pleased, but kind of surprised to see in a church kind of context. Because that's not been my experience, right? Like, you're lucky if you get the nice liberal version of equality in churches, never mind this slightly more political in a good way version of it.
Yeah, I think obviously I'm in contact with the other equality officers in like the different regional churches in Germany. Like, we regularly connect. We have conferences 2 times per year where we all meet, and also sometimes like have common projects like that we do together. I don't think in that regard it is uncommon to take a more like political stance on it as well. And the rise of anti-feminism and also like anti-gender studies movements have just been so huge and so threatening that I think to an extent we all also like, obviously on the one hand, it's just the right thing to do to like stand up against that. And also, like, we have to do it because they want us gone, right? Like, so we would, like, it's not only entirely altruistic to stand up of that. It's also like, But then obviously, like, almost all of us are women. We have one male colleague who's great, but almost all of us are women.
Is he the affirmative hiring? Like, we're going to have some of a, one man allowed. Like.
Maybe, yeah. Who knows? Different regional church. I'm not privy to how that came about, but he's a very good colleague. What I like about my work is that the kind of position I have is as far removed from hierarchies as you can get in a church admin thing. Yeah. So obviously I have somebody who is my manager and who can like sort of tell me what to do, but I do get a lot of leeway. Basically, it is my job to like promote gender justice, to promote justice for queer people and things like that. And in that, I have a lot of room to do what I think is important. And obviously, there's a lot of stuff that I can't just do. I mean, I can invite people for talks and for readings, and I can do events that I can just like do together with co-workers. But then obviously there's more structural projects that just require a lot of collaboration and a lot of preparation, where I do also need the church leadership to like be convinced and work with me, because otherwise it's not possible. That often takes time. And there are obviously also people in the church who very much dislike that, who think that that kind of work is way too political and, too concerned with too few people, as it's always when you're like doing work for marginalized groups. But I think it is important to do, even though sometimes it's tiring. And I think with regards to some things, we are getting somewhere. For example, like one big thing that I'm currently working on, which is still like in the early stages, but definitely getting somewhere, is like we do want to look at our own regional church's history of discrimination against queer people. And essentially we want to work with like academics who will do a proper academic inquiry in this, and they can look at all, the old files, see have there been people whose careers have been stopped because they came out, or whose careers have been like maybe not entirely stopped but didn't go the way they could have otherwise. Have people been fired for this? And also just what was the general atmosphere? Could people live openly without fear? Obviously, we all know that there was a lot of homophobia in the church regarding theology and stuff like that, which will also be a part of the project, like looking at that and how that has in parts changed, in other parts and other Christian groups not changed.
I'm interested how the kind of work is kind of, I guess, perceived by kind of people in the pews, because it's one thing for an organisation, and it's a good thing for an organisation doing this sort of work, but is that something that everyday people who come to these churches is that something they're kind of supportive of, involved in? What is the kind of relationship to this sort of stuff?
It's a good question, because my office is like in the church admin building. So I'm sort of like mostly concerned, or not mostly concerned, but like I am most often in contact with people who work like in the big church admin thing. And getting into contact with people like on the basis is sometimes not as easy. Like there's a couple of like events that I host or participate in or help organize. Like we have an annual Pride service, for example. I participate in like other services where I do meet people like directly, which is always really lovely. And at those kinds of events, the feedback has usually been very positive. Like especially at Pride, we had like a little info booth as well about Christianity that's queer affirming, and where we also just like were visible as queer Christians ourselves. And I was a bit worried about that at first, because obviously there's a lot of queer people who for very, very legit reasons are not very open towards anything Christianity and church related. But the feedback on that has been extremely lovely. And lots of people were like, oh, it's great to see that people like you are also in the church and that you exist. And there have been some congregations, some vicars as well, who've like invited me for talks and little info segments. But I think it really depends. Obviously, there's also like just a lot of other topics going on in a lot of churches. Like the German church in everywhere, including Bremen, is losing members, is therefore losing money. And a lot of congregations at this point, I think, have the biggest worry of like, do we have to merge with another congregation? Will we still have a vicar in 2 years' time? Can we actually still afford to maintain our church buildings? So I think for many of them, maybe gender equality is currently not at the forefront of their minds. But I guess that's kind of also why I'm there, to keep reminding people, yes, there's also a lot of other important topics, but let's not forget this, because if we don't keep active and if we don't keep thinking about it, things will just be pushed back. There's going to be a rollback if we become inactive.
I find it fascinating, like as someone who isn't particularly interested in kind of converting people or evangelizing people, that actually in terms of like church growth, I don't know what it's like in Germany, but certainly in this country, like one of the most underserved groups is like queer Christians or people who support queer people in Christian, just by being a church that is progressive or, queer affirming, you open a space where people who might not have other church options to attend can come to. I think people can see it as like a secondary thing, and I'd want to say that's wrong on like some kind of moral basis, but also actually, if your concern is to have bums on pews, as they say, like actually being a place that is known to be affirming of queer people or even just affirming of women, and takes these kind of stances, there are people who may not have other churches that they could feel like they could be part of. It kind of creates spaces for these people in a way that, I'm not necessarily interested in converting people, but you can probably do some quite successful stuff simply by being a place people feel comfortable.
Yeah, and I mean, not only church members, but also people who want to work for the church. And at that point, it probably needs to be said that like the Protestant Church in Germany is way behind on like equality laws for its employees. So yeah, that is something that I'm also trying to work on, but that's like one of those huge topics, obviously, that will take a lot of time. But I think in Germany, I think like in several other countries as well, it's also more and more difficult to find people who want to become vicars. And I've heard stories from people who were vicars way back in the 80s and who were gay and who were not allowed, or like they couldn't live openly. They couldn't be out because they would have lost their jobs and stuff like that. And I mean, when I hear that as a queer person nowadays, I'm just like, I wouldn't even want to work for the church if that were the case. Like I would up and quit, right? Like I would not take that. And obviously that's like my privilege of having grown up in a much more progressive environment and everything. And I have huge respect for the people who like had to deal with that kind of much more overtly homophobic thing back then. But like, I think also with that regard, it's important for the church to look at themselves and see how can people work for us and be safe from discrimination. But then obviously the most important reason is it's just the right and Christian thing to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, although this is fascinating and we could probably talk for another couple of hours, for the sake of our poor listeners and Adam who has to edit this, that is probably about all that we have time for. Thank you so much, Antonia, for joining us. It has been absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, thank you for the invite.
Yeah, and it's been really great to kind of hear about a bit of your work at the end there as well, which I think is really important, and it's really fascinating to kind of, I don't know, I find it uplifting to hear that there's important work like this being done by institutional churches or kind of set up churches like elsewhere, even if it's not necessarily happening over here. Like good things are happening in some places is the main thing. Antonia, do you have anything you want to plug, or if anyone wants to get in contact with you, do you have anything you want to direct them to?
I mean, if any of the listeners do speak German, I have an Instagram account for my work. It's at gleichstellung.kirche.bremen on Instagram. But it is about my work and it is German, so I don't know how relevant this is.
If you speak German, you're going to know how to spell all that.
Probably, yes.
Although I would also say, surely part of the joy of Instagram is that it's visual, so you don't necessarily need to have the language. You go, I know what any of this means, but there's some pretty photos.
Yeah.
If anyone wants to get in touch with us, the best way of doing that is all the contact details are on breadandrosaries.com. We have a Patreon if you want to chuck us some pennies, or if you'd like to put reviews on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever else you get
Please
your podcasts.
give us reviews. We like reviews.
Yeah,
even bad ones.
Yeah.
We like reviews.
But good
They're
ones.
helpful.
Good ones are better than bad ones.
Not bad ones. We don't want bad reviews. If you're going to give us a bad review, give us a good one instead.
But yeah, do get in touch if you have anything to say. Adam, where the welcome people find you?
You can find me most places at CommieXIAN.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. And thank you, Antonia. See you later.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.